Please clap. Had a Jeb Bush moment right here on the stage. All right, guys, I'm excited to be moderating this panel dealing with criminal justice reform. You may have noticed that we've had a little bit of an emphasis on this at this conference. And, you know, the reason for that is that it is a conservative issue, both in the sense of the amount of money that is spent on incarcerating the current prison population and dealing with a lot of the crime-related issues, but also in terms of taking away someone's freedom for an extended period of time and throwing them away in a jail cell is the most intrusive thing that a government does, which is not to say that it's not justified sometimes, but it's something that ought to be done with perhaps a little more care than is sometimes done as well. And so I'm delighted to welcome to the stage, first of all, my friend, Jason Pye from FreedomWorks. Jason, thanks for dressing up for the panel today.
Oh, no problem.
Appreciate
glad
that.
to dress up.
Appreciate that. And then also Marc Levin, who is with the Right On Crime folks, who I'm a big fan of their work. Encourage everybody to go to their website, Right On Crime, and check them out. My friend Chuck DeVore is over there, and they have done a lot of outstanding work kind of studying these issues from a conservative perspective in terms of, I think all of us want to see justice when crime occurs, but how do we do it in a smarter way that doesn't place burden on state budgets and isn't careful with the lives that are sometimes ruined by going through the criminal justice system in the process. So I'm going to start with you, Marc, and just kind of toss out a question to you. What do you think is the number one problem that needs to be addressed in terms of the criminal justice system in America today?
Well, it's hard to know where to start, but I am sorry for the disappointment that you didn't get Paul Ryan in person. You didn't even get the real Marc Levin. But I'll do my best here as the other one. But anyway, yeah, I think that it's hard to say. I mean, I think one of the most obvious is the number of criminal laws. There's now over 4,500 criminal laws at the federal level. The Congressional Research Office actually gave up counting. In Texas, we counted them over 1,700, including my favorite, 11 felonies relating to harvesting oysters. And in fact, just today, there's a story I shared on social media about a woman in Texas who has an arrest warrant for selling homemade tamales. She had put them up on some website, and she got something in the mail. She owes $700, or else she's going to be arrested and a fine from the city of Carrollton, Texas. So there's a lot of things that shouldn't even be crimes to begin with. And then, of course, there's those things that should be crimes but have excessive punishment, where something else, whether it's a drug court or community service or making restitution to the victim, a lot of other things would actually do more, get better results at a lower cost to taxpayers than throwing someone in prison.
So, Jason, let me go to you. And I don't know if I'm going to put you on the spot. I should have asked you this before this. Have you ever read the book, 3 Felonies a Day?
Yes, actually, my wife bought it for me for Christmas.
So this is a great book. I want to recommend anybody who's here, you can just look it up. It's available on Amazon. It's called 3 Felonies a Day. And one of the things that I hear a lot of times from conservatives when I talk to them about this issue is, yeah, hey, you know what? If you can't do the time, don't do the crime. And what that book goes through, in piggybacking off what Marc said, is that if a federal or state officer followed you around all day and looked really hard at what you did and knew the laws, they could probably nail you for 3 felonies a day.
Oh, absolutely. I think, and Marc was talking about overcriminalization, we have as many as, some estimates are as high as 400,000 regulations that carry criminal penalties. 400,000. Professor John Baker once said that there is no person in the United States over the age of 18 who cannot be indicted for some federal crime. We're all criminals. It's just a matter of who gets caught and who doesn't. If a prosecutor wants to indict you tomorrow, he could. It's overcriminalization. We're talking about the serious challenges facing the criminal justice system. Overcriminalization, obviously, is one that's it's a severe issue. It's a severe challenge, and there are pieces of legislation working through Congress right now that could address that through some sort of default mens rea or criminal intent standard that would protect people who unwittingly commit crimes. You look at someone like Lawrence Lewis. Lawrence Lewis was a technician at a retirement home in Northwest Washington, D.C. They had a sewage backup in a part of the retirement home that vulnerable people lived. And to deal with the backup, they operated off their SOP. They diverted the sewage, what he thought was going into DC's sewer system. It actually went into the Rock Creek, which is a tributary to the Potomac River, and he violated federal law. And he was actually, he got prosecuted for it. He ended up paying a fine. He had to do, I think he got probation, right?
But yeah, but he ended up losing his job.
He ended up losing his job.
The EPA police
right.
just showed up and arrested him.
There's another woman, her last name, I think her name is Allison Capo, who, her and her daughter rescued a woodpecker it was about to be eaten by the family cat. It was a baby woodpecker. And a Fish and Wildlife Service officer followed them into a grocery store and actually threatened her with a fine and potentially jail time for breaking the Migratory Birds Act. This is just touching the extent of the problem. And this is something that, I mean, and I realize that in the past, conservatives have had a tendency to want to lock, throw people in jail and throw away the key. But I think what we're seeing at the state level and what we hope to see at the federal level is a real conversation on criminal justice reform, both in terms of sentencing reforms, corrections reform that truly rehabilitates prisoners, because right now we're just warehousing them, and prevents us all from basically being criminals, because like I said, there is not one of us, including myself, who could not be charged with a crime. Just a real quick survey. How many of you had Netflix? How many of you have given a loved one your password, your username and password to Netflix? You have committed a federal crime, according to the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. So this is just an idea of the extent of the problem. So that's yeah.
So one of the things that's kind of my pet issues on this, Mark, when we talk about criminal justice reform, in the United States, we have about one police officer for every 330 civilians, or non-police. Police officers are civilians, but one police officer for every 330 non-police officers. The way that works is that there is broad respect for the rule of law. That's a necessary aspect of a society that doesn't have way more policemen than any of us want to see, just policemen standing on every corner. People have to trust that the justice system is fair, that it treats them well, that it protects them, that everyone is more or less treated equally. Talk about, if you would, Mark, how these over-criminalizations and people thrown in jail for things like, trying to save the woodpecker or some of these other things are actually can contribute to a worsening crime problem in that respect.
Absolutely. No, that's a great point. And, obviously we've had some disagreements with those on the far left on policing issues, but there are some valid points that have come out of things like Ferguson, where there were over 3 warrants per household, mostly for traffic violations, code violations. There was a woman who was facing going to jail for an overgrown lawn in Ferguson. So the problem is when you have all these warrants outstanding for these minor things, who wants to report a crime to go to the police and say a serious crime occurred, because they themselves, of course, have a few warrants for their arrest, generally for minor traffic things, for example. So having too many laws, it's like when you try to do everything, you end up accomplishing almost nothing. So it dilutes kind of the respect for the criminal law, and it also undermines trust between police and the community. I think that one of the issues we're looking at now is the excessive number of fines and fees in the criminal justice system. And so people who have an outstanding fine for a city code violation or something, you're immediately kind of saying now police are going to have to go enforce all of these outstanding warrants. So you're setting yourself up for more negative interactions between the police and the community, instead of really focusing on those things that are fundamental to public safety, which is the core mission of our police department. So you're absolutely right that you can't, we all depend for our safety on people reporting those serious crimes, because you can't have a policeman on every corner. So what we need to do is make sure we have a higher number of these serious crimes reported and then solve those crimes too. In this country, 11% of property crimes are solved. If your car gets stolen or burglarized, the chances are that's not going to be solved. If your home gets burglarized, that's probably not going to be solved. Yet we have a police devoting their time to a lot of frivolous things that shouldn't even be crimes to begin with.
And I think one of the things that, to me, as a guy who's probably more socially conservative than somebody like Jason would be, is I would say a key ingredient to making the criminal justice system work is that being arrested and charged with a crime needs to carry a stigma with it in order to have any deterrent effect at all. right? It needs to be something that if you get, and this is still true in a lot of places, that if the police come to your house and carry you away in cuffs, not only do you face whatever consequence you face from the justice system, but your friends and neighbors think less of you. And that's an important part of the way that our society works. When you have these communities where everyone has got 2 or 3 warrants for things like having an overgrown lawn, I think it contributes to the breakdown of that. And it becomes a thing where it just breeds further disrespect of the law going on and on. Jason, what do you talk a little bit about the budgetary issues that a lot of these criminal justice problems create and how they can be fixed by criminal justice reform?
Yeah, I think you look at the criminal justice system across all levels of government, state, federal, and local. $80 billion a year is how much we spend. The United States has 5% of the world's population. We have 25% of its prisoners. Our incarceration rate is higher than Russia and China combined. We incarcerate about 730 people per 100,000 residents. That's ridiculous. Louisiana has, I think, the highest incarceration rate in the country. I think it exceeds about 1,100 per 100,000 people. These come with real budgetary effects. I mean, you look at what I think the Federal Bureau of Prisons, their budget, I think last year was $6.9 billion. In 1980, it was just under $1 billion adjusted for inflation. The federal prison population has grown from 25,000 prisoners, give or take a few, to I think it maxed out in 2013 at 218,000. Again, that's out of 2.2 million. The federal prison population is relatively small, but nevertheless, these come with real costs, $30,000 per prisoner. And when you talk about even looking more at the budgetary effects, they extend far past just incarceration. Some of these communities that are seeing that have high rates of crime or have the people who have been incarcerated, they go back into they have nothing waiting for them. They don't have job prospects. The communities are ravaged by crime and people who have criminal records. They can't get an education. I think that's one thing we've seen with Texas, for example, and Marc can speak more knowledgeably on Texas. But in Texas, they had a small investment, $241 million, I think is what it was. And they were looking at $500+ million in immediate prison construction costs, $2 or $3 billion over the next through 2012, I believe. This was back in 2007 when they started looking at this. They focused. Texas doesn't really have mandatory minimum sentences, but they did do some sentencing reforms. They implemented these corrections reforms that focused on rehabilitative programming, job skills, education, work training, and we've seen that the results of it work. Crime dropped by 24% since those reforms were enacted. So it enhances public safety, regardless of what some of the, despite what the junior senator from Arkansas would have you believe.
But it has to be done intelligently.
It has to be, it absolutely has to be done intelligently. But the long-term savings of the Texas reforms, you talk about budgetary impacts, $3 billion.
And we're talking about nonviolent offenders.
Exactly.
And the thing is, we can track them. If you went to state jail in Texas for drug possession, which is less than a gram as a state jail felony, you would be going to state jail for like 6 months. So you're not, I mean, the one thing prisons do well is incapacitate a murderer, a rapist, someone who's dangerous for a long period of time. If they commit another crime, it's going to be against another prisoner. You know, when you go for 6 months, you get disconnected from employment, from your family, church, anything positive, and then you're right back out again. And of course, that's not to mention all the bad people you meet while you're incarcerated, so you actually come out more of a risk than when you came in. So we've been able to see over 4 or 5 years, someone who went to a drug court has far less likely to commit crimes than someone who went to state jail for 6 months. That's the thing people always forget is 99% of people who go to prison do get out eventually. Yep. And particularly those that get out after a very short period, they're still young, they're still in kind of the prime crime committing years. Now, the other thing I wanted to mention on the cost side is it's also other costs. It's pensions, for example. You have states where, like Ohio, where 30% of the people on government pensions are former correctional employees, prison guards and such. So we're not even counting, when you look at the prison cost per day or the total corrections budget, all of the cumulative costs of putting so many people behind bars. Now, as you said earlier, there are people, we're not those on the far left who say no one needs to go to prison. There are people who need to go there. But one of the things we're finding is in order to get people to comply with probation, for example, things like swift and certain sanctions, such as a weekend in jail if you fail a drug test, a weekend in jail if you are not showing up to see your probation officer, that's really effective, especially when you tell people up front, this is what's going to happen. It's swift, sure, and commensurate. It's the certainty of the sanction and the swiftness and the proximity in time. But you have offenders who tell the judge, oh, I don't mind going to prison in a few months, but I've got plans this weekend. I can't go to jail for the weekend. So that really, it's a 2/3 reduction in recidivism from using these swift and certain and commensurate sanctions, and plus positive incentives, saying you can earn time off your probation, which we've passed in other states. If you're exemplary, you pay all your restitution. You can earn your way off of probation, and that's just like the real world in a job. You're judged by your performance.
Real fast, there are a couple of things I want to note. One thing I think we all have to keep in mind, Pat Nolan, I think, uses this a lot. I know people at Right on Crime use it a lot as well. But prisons should be for people we're scared of, not people we're mad at. And we incarcerate way too many nonviolent, low-level offenders in prisons. And that's at all levels of government. Thank God states like Georgia and Texas and Mississippi and South Carolina, all these conservative and Republican states, most recently Oklahoma, who under Mary Fallin got rid of its 3 strikes laws. They're addressing these issues in the right way, talking about the right way. But for those of you, since we asked earlier about Netflix, for those of you who have Netflix, there's a documentary I think you guys should watch. It's called Kids for Cash. And you want to talk about people who are exposed to other prisoners and what happens. There was particularly one kid, his last name is Bodner. I don't remember his first name. I think it may have been Justin. But he was talking about how he was exposed, and he learned more about being a criminal in prison than from anything that he had learned on the outside before he had a record. And these are kids who went to jail for the most marginal of offenses. So if you have Netflix, please check out Kids for Cash. It's a great doc.
And the judge got a kickback.
But
The judge also got 25 years in
don't
jail.
give a loved one your password so they can watch that.
Exactly.
And get their own Netflix.
Yeah.
So one of the challenges, and I'll throw this open to both of you to answer. One of the challenges, of course, that you face when you start talking about criminal justice reform is the political challenge, right? There's no political, or almost no political benefit, Republican or Democrat, to coming out and saying people should spend less time in prison.
Right.
I mean, even if you look at the path for Democrats to come to higher office, they come through a lot of district attorney office, mayor's offices, chief of police in the large cities. That's kind of their path up. And the way that they kind of escalate is they, just like conservatives, speak tough on crime. That's the way a lot of them are. And there's a reason for that, right? Because any of us who know somebody who's been a victim, in particular of a violent crime, have this inborn feeling that people who murder and rape and steal should be punished, right? And should have to go to jail or should face some very serious consequence because they've brought a serious problem into somebody else's life who wasn't expecting it. How do people who support this kind of separate those kinds of cases from the ones we're talking about and get through to people to understand the necessity of this is not that we're trying to say people should be able to murder and rape and steal and basically get away with it and we're going to pat them on the back and go out in the street.
Well, I mean, people who commit crimes, people who commit especially violent crimes deserve to go to jail. They deserve to be in jail for long periods of time. I don't disagree with that. But you have people who have been locked up for 55 years or gotten life sentences. We'll use an example, Weldon Angelos, who just got out of jail. Weldon Angelos was given a 55-year sentence for selling about $1,000 worth of marijuana. He was given sentencing enhancements. He was a first-time offender. He was getting sentencing enhancements, 3 of them, I believe, because he had a gun in his possession. Now, Weldon didn't brandish the gun. He didn't shoot the gun. He didn't do anything with the gun. It just happened to be there. And he got, even though it was first-time offense, he was prosecuted under U.S. Code 924C, which it's aimed at recidivists, people who repeatedly break the law, violent offenders who repeatedly break the law. He got 5 years under the first sentencing enhancement, and then 25 years for each additional one. In total, 55 years because they're served back to back. So he's an example. But like I said, though, he just got out of jail. And then there's another one, Sharonda Jones. She was part of she was a low-level player in a drug ring based somewhere in Texas, I think the Houston area. She got a life sentence. And she was a nonviolent offender. She got a life sentence because
Life without parole.
Life without parole, because there is no parole at the federal level. She got a life sentence because, get this, she had a concealed carry permit. She didn't have a gun. She had a concealed carry permit. Obviously, there's something wrong with sentencing enhancements, but the biggest tool politicians have, and we're seeing this play out at the federal level right now, including in the presidential race, is fear. Crime is down. I'm sorry to counter the narrative that's been put out there by people who are screaming about crime being up, but crime is down. You can go out there and it's a simple Google search. Crime is down. Violent crime is down by 49% since 1993. Violent crime, that was the homicide rate. Violent crime committed with a gun is down by 75% since 1993. Anybody who's saying otherwise is flat out lying to you. And that includes presidential candidates, United States senators, the junior senator from Arkansas.
Now, I mean, we do the upticks in certain cities like Chicago and Baltimore that are, of course, run, I think, incompetently. I mean, and you had issues like in Baltimore with that DA certainly undermining the police department, but of course, she's a left-wing Democrat. But there are many cities where crime is continuing to fall, including violent crime. So there's some where it's up, but there's others where it's down. There's certainly no consistent trend. And again, we're just talking here about the last 6 months or the last 12 months. But if you look at the last 20 years, as you pointed out, it's been a steep decline almost everywhere. But it has declined in more places than others. I mean, it's declined more in New York City than Chicago, for example, which shows you good policing, things like which Mayor Giuliani implemented, things like CompStat, data-driven policing, where you have the police in the right place at the right time, in those hot spots where there's problems. Those things really do work. And there's studies that show you can deter a lot of street crime through those approaches. Now, the other thing you brought up, I mean, obviously we're all in agreement as far as tough penalties for violent crime. I mean, now, violent crime is a big category. You have bar fights, right? You have misdemeanor assaults, but we're talking about serious violent crime. Property crime is, obviously more complicated. You certainly want to look at, we have things now called actuarial risk and needs assessments where you can figure out what somebody's risk is of committing additional crimes. And then also look at the fact that a lot of these property crimes are people who have an addiction. So if you can get them into a drug court as well, someone who's shoplifting or bouncing hot checks and things like that, they may need that. If you stop the addiction, you stop the property crime. There's, again, you have to, it's not a cookie cutter thing. That's a problem with our schools, for example, is you don't tailor the education to the individual student. It's the same here. You've got to assess the person you're dealing with, just like if they came into a hospital, and then figure out the right intervention.
Go ahead.
I just wanted to say, and I'm going to go back to Sharonda Jones just real quickly, the woman that Jason mentioned. She had, as of last year, or the year before, I wrote about her case at Redstate. She had at that time served 18 years of a life without parole sentence. And I wrote about the case. Her attorney found me through social media and asked would I look at it. And I said, yeah, and a few days later I got around to reading it and I wrote it up and I just said, it feels like this is a person who might deserve some commutation of her sentence. I feel like she's, okay, put her in jail for some time, but I feel like 18 hours for a drug crime is probably, or 18 years for a drug crime, a nonviolent drug crime is probably enough. And the end result is, a bunch of angry comments and emails from people. And I definitely get that there's a lot of anger about crime and people who have been exposed to crime. It's just I hope that we can get to a point that there's not such a reflexive response that the facts of the case don't matter. And in fact, I was pleased to learn that last year, as a matter of fact, Sharonda Jones was released in June, her sentence was commuted by President Obama. I put up a post, just said, I'm glad that this happened again. A lot of angry kind of comments and emails about that. And
that's one thing, and I think one thing especially because TPPF and Right on Crime, you guys don't have an activist space. FreedomWorks has an activist space. We have 5.7 million activists across the country. And it's easier to explain this stuff when you get in one-on-one settings. We have activist fly-ins about every quarter. We bring people to our DC office or we fly out to another city and I think we're doing one in Chicago next weekend. Speaking of cities with high crime rates. But we get the one-on-one settings. We can explain it. We can explain why it's conservative in nature and it works. But your work on Sharonda Jones, actually, I think you were the first person I saw talk about her, and I actually started using her as an example after I read your blog post. So thank you for that.
So let me say one other thing, and then we're going to open the floor for some brief questions. One of the things that's in kind of the media right now, of course, there are a lot of the police interaction with citizens videos. You guys are both Texas folks. And as I'm sure you
Georgia.
probably know, the Dallas Police Department, which was tragically the victim of the shootings that happened, the Dallas Police Department is actually one of the best police departments in the entire country in terms of reforming its interactions with citizens.
Yeah.
Talk for a little bit, if you guys would, about some of the things that they have done in terms of teaching the police to de-escalate confrontations and some of the success that they've had in terms of reducing a lot of the incidences that we see about on the news.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and that was a tragic irony of this, horrendous shooting in Dallas. And I think you look at it, some of the things they've done, training officers. I mean, that is critical. They need to understand things like mental illness when they encounter someone who may not understand their commands. And that is a critical thing, and they're able to learn techniques for de-escalating that situation. And then, of course, they need to be trained on what to do if a lot of times someone may be reaching, you don't know if they're reaching for their driver's license or they're reaching for their gun. But officers also, in Dallas and other places have the taser. They have other options besides just shooting someone. So, it's a delicate balance because we, of course, need to recognize when we're going back and looking at tapes, hindsight can be 20/20, and these are split-second decisions. But if they've got the right training, they can make better decisions. And some of these shootings, undoubtedly, the officer didn't have a criminal intent. They may not be criminal, but they were still bad policing. They could have done it better if they had had the appropriate training, for example. And frankly, the other thing is also not everyone is cut out to be a police officer. We just started a new policing program with a former sheriff and another lifetime cop, and we're researching these things. We're dealing with civil asset forfeiture, police militarization as critical issues, but also looking at the fact that you need to screen people when you hire to begin with, because somebody who has a certain personality type who is, hot-tempered, right? They may not be cut out to be a cop. Maybe they should be in another profession. Now, one of these guys we hired ran the police academy in the Metroplex. So he dealt with this on a daily basis and got people coming in for training, and some of them, just weren't cut out personality-wise to be a cop. It doesn't mean they're a bad person. So those are some of the things involved.
I would say
one of the things that's interesting, I'm going to let Jason, so one of the things that's interesting about what Dallas has done is that people assume that by telling cops to be slower about use of force and de-escalating techniques is that you're going to place the police at risk. Not only have they virtually eliminated instances in which the police kill suspects, they've also drastically reduced the instances in which the police themselves are the victims of violence during the course of interactions with the citizenry. So it does work in terms of two-way street. Go ahead, Jason.
the only thing I was going to say, and I really don't have much to add based on what they're saying, but I think one of the problems here, and I say this as a son of a police officer. My father served in the city of Atlanta. I'm from Georgia, not Texas, by the way.
We'll claim him, though. We'll take it.
No, I mean, Texas is great, don't get me wrong. But my father served in Atlanta in Forest Park, which is just south of Atlanta, just by a few miles. And I say this, I think I look at this and I see we ask police officers to do way too much. They're treating mental health. They're having to respond to mental health crises in the field. They're school counselors. They're drug counselors. We ask them to do way too much. And I think
chasing dogs, like the Dallas police chief said.
No, I think that's one reason I think the reforms that we're working on, particularly at the federal level, addressing recidivism, lowering recidivism, as has been done in Texas and Georgia and these other Republican states. I think we start addressing the root cause of the problem, and the cops can go back to doing what they're supposed to be doing, which is protecting and serving communities. And I think tomorrow we're going to get in a lot of this with our panel on civil asset forfeiture, which deals more with policing than some of the discussions here. But I mean, we just have to let police, and and that means doing their jobs, getting them away from arresting someone for selling $10 of pot on the street.
Okay, so we're going to open the floor for questions. I'm going to ask you guys to come to the mic, but everybody else up here has been nice. I'm going to be ruthless with y'all. You get 20 seconds to ask your question. We're going to try to get as many questions through. 20 seconds. 20 seconds, you're cut off. All right, here we go. So just get to the meat of it right away.
You are hardcore, man.
A check and a balance. More judicial discretion, less mandatory sentencing laws. Judges have to stand for review both judicially and electorally.
You are a man after my own heart. Mandatory minimum sentences are big government in the courtroom. It's the legislative branch interfering on the judicial branch. In Jason Pye's perfect world, we get rid of mandatory minimum sentences.
But he's absolutely right. That's one of the that's why we got mandatory minimums, is because people were upset at unaccountable, unelected federal judges. But in Texas, we elect our judges in partisan elections. So if people don't like their decisions, they can be voted out of office.
Yeah.
And this is one of the things that I hate that so much of our policy in this country is made off of bad things that happen in the news.
Yep.
And that's a terrible way to generate actual policy that governs everyone. So you see a story about like this guy in San Francisco who got 6 months of probation for raping the woman, and everyone is justifiably outraged. And the response is, let's make a law that literally everyone has to have a 30-year sentence for this particular kind of crime. And it's not, be angry at the judge, maybe let's not change the entire, make it a continual one-way ratchet to solve this problem.
And one more thing about mandatory minimum sentences is the vast majority of cases that are tried are done through a plea bargain. Because prosecutors, they hang the mandatory minimum sentences over the heads of the offender, and the offender most likely comes from an area, they don't have a lot of money, they don't have resources, they get a public defender, and they have no choice but to take the plea deal or face a 5, 10, 15-year sentence in prison, whether it's state prison or federal prison.
Yes, ma'am. Briefly, your question.
Yes, my brief question is, what do we have to do in terms of how we address serious mental illnesses in order to reduce the need for police officers to deal with that? And I would note in Los Angeles County, where I'm from, half of the people incarcerated in the county jail have serious, and I mean like schizophrenia, and they see people who aren't there.
Okay.
Half of them have serious mental illnesses, and you already alluded, we shouldn't expect the police to be dealing with that, but somebody has to deal with it.
Sure.
Marc.
Well, one of the things that they're doing in Houston and some other places is they literally, for these people that have had, they call them frequent flyers, like 50 times or more to the county jail in 1 year. It's usually trespass, public urination, things. But they're going by their house a few times a week, and it may be a police officer with a clinician or nurse or whoever. But they make sure, are you taking your medications? That's a big one. And by the way, there's like injectables now where you can actually watch, and it's good for 30 days, and you know the person did that. They could do it at a minute clinic and be marked off. But make sure they're taking their medication, make sure they're stable, they're going to their counseling appointments, and it has a huge reduction in them going to the jail. Just checking on them a few times a week, and it's a lot cheaper.
And the political problem that you run into there is people say, oh my gosh, who's going to pay for this doctor and this cop to come out there? It's cheaper than you would cost to keep putting them away 50 times in a year into your jail. So anyway, yes, sir.
Drug records can be permanent and take a toll on people's opportunities in life. Are there any avenues to reduce the long-term stigma of having a record?
Oh, absolutely. Re-entry reforms, ban the box, record sealing and expungement. Ban the box has been getting a lot of attention. A lot of states are doing it for state employment. Some private industries or companies are doing it as well. I think Starbucks, Coke Industries, a handful of others. FreedomWorks, we don't have the criminal history box on our applications. It doesn't preclude any employer from doing a background check on a potential employee. But record sealing and expungement, I think Doug Deason has been actively involved in that in Texas. And he comes at it from personal experience. He was arrested as a 17-year-old for stealing alcohol from a neighbor's house. I think that's the case.
We had a
right?
house party.
It was, yeah, and he had a criminal record. He got a record for it. And thankfully, his family was in a position where they could he would serve his sentence. I think it was probation, and he got it expunged from his record. But a lot of other people, I mean, there's a guy who I used to pay to cut my grass who, he had the best job he could get was landscaping, and the reason is because he had I think probation for 15 years for a one-time cocaine violation. These are, and particularly people of color, it destroys their lives. These communities people don't understand that. People talk about how mandatory minimum sentences and the tough on crime aspect or approach that we've taken to crime in the past, particularly at the federal level, because I mentioned earlier, because 200,000 people out of 2.2 million is not that many, but some in Congress seem to believe that federal sentencing laws are responsible for this drastic drop in violent crime. It's absolutely not true. Most people are incarcerated at the state level. So, and thankfully, the states are leading the way on reentry policies, smart reentry policies that allow people to become tax-paying, productive citizens of society, and I hope Reagan conservatives or libertarians.
And real quick, a couple other things we did were liability relief, saying employers and landlords can't be sued for hiring or renting to ex-offenders, and also occupational licensing, saying you could get a temporary occupational license, and then as long as you follow the rules of that occupation, no more crimes, you can become permanently licensed.
For me, and again, I'm maybe more of an old school conservative, less of a libertarian. My personal feeling on that would be if you reduce the amount of things that will actually land you in jail and get you a record, I would be less likely to view that as urgent because, like I said, I do believe that certain kinds of crimes in particular should carry a stigma with them. I think that that's an important part of reinforcing the community's job in terms of preventing crime taking place. I know a lot of people who would be way more bothered by what their neighbors and friends and family would think of them. That's a much more effective deterrent on crime than facing some misdemeanor sentence and going on probation. That's just me. Anyway, yes, sir. Briefly.
Your comments on the liberalization of civil asset forfeiture laws and the politicization of police departments to turn them into revenue-generating agencies, particularly within, minority communities in inner cities, and how that erodes the respect for law enforcement.
Oh, I mean, we'll have an entire discussion about this issue tomorrow. Civil asset forfeiture is something that Freedom works on extensively, as is right on crime. But I think you just look at and I'll have more of these examples tomorrow, just look at some of the cities or police departments around the country and how they view policing. They're not going after the drugs going into cities, they're going for the money coming out of cities. It is policing for profit, and there's no way of getting around it. And I say that as a son of a former police officer.
And it's, where I live in Tennessee, the drug runners are carrying the drugs to the east on I-40 and the money to the west on I-40.
Right.
And they've had numerous stories in the local news showing the police monitoring the left-hand lane the westbound lanes almost exclusively, and that goes that promotes disrespect for the rule of law. I think.
It runs roughshod over due process. We have a right to have our case heard, to have the government bear the government's supposed to have the burden of proof. You're supposed to be able to go in. The government's supposed to be able to show that you did something wrong. In civil asset forfeiture, you don't have to be arrested, you don't have to be charged, you don't have to be convicted, and the government can take your stuff.
Okay. You have to prove.
And you have to prove. You have to prove. In
We've got a
most
whole
states.
panel on this tomorrow.
It really
Yes,
upsets
sir.
me. There's a paper outside on it.
Yes, sir.
Given the demographics of the incarcerated population, I would think that your position would have a lot of support from Democrats. And so what is the obstacle to broad bipartisan action on this issue?
I think you want.
Well, you've already mentioned certain senators.
Well,
right?
the junior senator from Arkansas.
Yeah, well, we're now, to be fair, there are some things that those on the left, that we don't necessarily, where we do part company, right? But I think on most of this stuff, there is a great deal of consensus, and it's backed up by research about what works, which I think is really important. So, I mean, the biggest challenge we're facing in Washington is just there's so few calendar days left in, both chambers. But you heard Speaker Ryan's commitment, and obviously we're hopeful when it comes to the Senate. I think that there's some people on the left who I think that conservatives are just in this to save money, and I'm really, frankly, offended by that because, it's also about keeping families together. It's about just right-sizing government and protecting individual liberty, getting people into the workforce. We have our old former Senator Phil Gramm of Texas used to say we need more people pulling the wagon and fewer people riding in it. And he was talking about welfare reform, but it's very true here as well. So I think that, but in the states, Georgia, 3 years in a row, unanimous passing this stuff. So that's where Republicans, and even in Washington, where the left-wing Democrats and Obama are trying to sabotage the default mens rea because they want to throw business executives in prison. Well, we passed that in the last few years with the free market think tanks in Ohio and in Michigan, default mens rea with a unanimous vote, all the Democrats voting for that. And the black Democrats on House Judiciary voted for it too.
We're
Can I add something real quick? Real quick. So a couple of things. It's a bipartisan problem. A lot of people don't realize that the Congressional Black Caucus actually endorsed the crack mandatory minimum that was passed in the 80s. They voted for the 1994 crime bill, which was Clinton's crime bill, that drastically increased incarceration over the course of the 1990s. So that's a point that I want everybody to remember here. But the problem right now is it's in Congress. We have some of the fear mongering that's going on, and it's coming mostly from the Republican side of the aisle. Unfortunately, there are a lot of Democrats who actually don't think the bills that are in Congress go far enough. I actually agree with that. They don't go far enough, but it's a good start. But one of the things that I keep hearing lately is, and particularly from a member who I respect, is that they don't want to move on criminal justice reform because they don't want to do anything that's going to build to Obama's legacy, which I think is a load of crap. This is a conservative legacy. 31 states, 32 states have passed criminal justice reform. This is a conservative issue. It's a fiscally conservative issue. It's pro-family if you're social conservative. We should all embrace this. And the fact that some of us are running away from it or some of us are scared of it, it boggles my mind. We have a chance to do something huge this year and reclaim a narrative that is rightfully ours.
And I think, and we're out of time here, I think that it is a huge deal that the spearhead of this movement was not a liberal Democrat from Massachusetts, but Rick Perry in Texas. I think that's a huge thing that's opened the door for a lot of people's eyes to say, wait a minute, if Rick Perry in Texas gets on board with this, in a state that is known as a law and order state, and a guy who's known as a law and order governor, and it works, I think that's a big step forward in terms of us moving forward on this nationally. We're out of time. Thank you guys very much for being on the panel. Thank you guys for your great questions. We're going to have a brief video.